This is the story of how we created our masterpiece.
How do I start?
Great. I wasn't filming. One more time.
Seriously?
This project started sometime in May of last year. Even though I've always been kind of interested in filmmaking, it just seemed like its own world. It seemed like a thing that was reserved for the professionals, those people who trained for it. And even though I kind of made a short film before, I never really thought of myself as an actual real filmmaker. I was just a YouTuber and filmmaking was its own thing. But I don't know what it was exactly, but a combination of factors changed last May, and I decided to just see what would happen if I tried for real to make an actual short film. It kind of felt like now or never. I had to try doing it. The first thing that I did was to contact one of my friends, because filmmaking feels more like a collaboration. Photography and even making YouTube videos often feels like a solo sport, but filmmaking is about collaboration. If you're a solo filmmaker, you're not really gonna make the best films possible. So luckily Dan agreed to basically make the whole film with me. So I was gonna be the writer, director, and the editor, while Dan was gonna be the DP and the camera operator and the colorist. So the first step was to write a script. The only problem is that I had no idea how to write. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that at first I even tried asking ChatGPT, but very quickly it became clear that was not going to work, and I was just actually going to have to figure out how to write a story of some kind. At that point I started watching a lot of YouTube videos and reading some basic screenwriting tips and books while trying to desperately come up with some sort of an idea. I came up with a bunch of ideas that were horrible. This is the first part of the process where having a collaborator is really useful, because you can bounce ideas off them and have all of them be shut down until something finally is half decent, half meaningful. And I would say we definitely wrote it together, mostly by me just throwing out ideas constantly and having Dan shut them down until we finally agreed on something that was half decent, that had some potential. Now, we didn't write this completely blindly. We had a certain list of things we wanted to include in the film. It was important to have the visual style that is present in both of our photography and videos in the film, obviously. We had a couple of spots in Tokyo in mind where we wanted to shoot. We had a couple of elements we wanted to include in the film. And we also wanted to avoid some of those very stereotypical first-timer filmmaker cliches. So we kind of wrote it around that. The story was intentionally quite simple, with no massive twist at the end. It was just more of a, let's say, subtle story about little things. Now, during the writing process, we definitely made a bunch of mistakes already, but I want to talk more about the mistakes we made at the end of this video, because we made a lot of mistakes. But anyway, once we finally had some sort of a concept to make the film about, then it was time, for me anyways, to pack my bags and head back to Tokyo and start scouting out some locations and finding actors and planning everything. Other locations we already had taken some photos in, like this bridge scene we had taken some photos in just a couple months before. You might have even seen it in my videos if you've followed me for a year or more. Or the shrine, it was just a place that I randomly found because it was close to my hotel that I really thought would be a nice spot, a nice peaceful spot for the film. This is where knowledge of the city is really a big benefit, and something if you're a beginner filmmaker with no access to, you know, Hollywood budgets or locations like that, just knowing the city really well is where you're gonna make up the difference, let's say. I guess I should talk about gear quickly. We filmed this on our own cameras, mainly the Sony A7S III My favorite lens that we used was Dan's Helios 44-2. It's a famous Soviet-era vintage lens that has this signature swirly bokeh and really cool flares, and generally just a look with a lot of character. And I got my own copy of the lens after the shoot. And then this weird wide-angle converted Nikon lens that Dan pulled out of somewhere that looks really wonky. Kind of like a very poor man's sort of anamorphic monstrosity of a lens. Now, one of the biggest problems with this film, and one of the reasons that we chose to film it in June, is that in June it is at least supposed to be the rainy season in Tokyo. Now, of course, if you followed me or even Dan for some time, you might have noticed that we really enjoy rainy weather. So of course it had to rain in the film, in the outdoor scenes. Shouldn't be a problem if it's the rainy season in Tokyo. It should rain every day, right? Wrong. For some reason, 2023 just didn't have rain. The only times when it would rain was usually at like 3-4 a.m. and you can't really shoot anything at 3 to 4 a.m. at a moment's notice, because for obvious reasons. So we were actually quite lucky that we managed to get the first day of shooting done relatively pain-free. It would actually rain when it was supposed to for that day. We were shooting for maybe like from 7 p.m. until literally the sunrise to get all those scenes. It didn't have to take that long, but because of the vague nature of our script, meaning that we didn't have any, or we only had like a very basic storyboard as well, and like cliff notes instead of an actual script. One of the biggest mistakes, definitely. I'll talk more about that later as well. But it was a chaotic mess the first day of filming that just somehow we pulled through. But at the same time, it was one of the most fun experiences I've had in a while, and I definitely learned a lot, even on the first day of shooting. Now, the problem started on the following scenes when we tried to schedule anything on a rainy day. It just usually wouldn't happen, or it would drizzle for like 20 minutes and was barely noticeable. Luckily for the bar scenes, we didn't really have to worry about rain, obviously. But it wasn't exactly a professional shoot on that day either. We just kind of showed up and asked a little bit if we could shoot, but we were also very discreet, and we ended up having to wait until the bar was totally empty of other customers to finish doing all the shots. It probably just looked like we were doing like a travel video and drinking while doing it, which was an interesting combination of a very stressful yet fun experience. But then on the outdoor scenes of the second scene, it took so many failed attempts because the rain would never work. And unfortunately, it took us until November to finish filming these scenes, even though there were just a very few scenes. Same thing in the hotel scenes. We wanted it to be raining outside, but of course, barely was raining. You can kind of see a couple of lightning strikes in some of these shots. So that was real, but then, we used a spray bottle to make it rain on the inside of the glass and just hoped that people wouldn't notice. It is only noticeable if you pay attention, but it actually did work out fairly well. Another fun thing that happened during that process was that we wanted to specifically shoot those hotel scenes with the iconic orange Tokyo Tower, but on the day that we were filming, for some reason it just happened to be one of those special light show days when it was blue for almost all of the time. So then we already didn't have a very clear, exact script, and then we had to shoot it out of sequence where the tower was orange for only like a half hour, maybe 45-minute period. So we had to rush all those shots at the end while having to shoot everything else in the beginning. Half of us was sick for half of the time of the shoots also. I mean, all this to say that even though it was a lot of fun, it also did make me realize that filmmaking is basically just problem solving almost all of the time. Of course, once we'd finished shooting, about 6 months after the first start of the project, now comes the time to edit this. Just like a month before the start of this project, I'd switched my editing software from Premiere Pro to DaVinci Resolve, which definitely was the correct move. I can't imagine going back to Premiere Pro after this, but that also meant that I'd only edited a couple YouTube videos before on DaVinci Resolve, so it was a brand new software to learn on top of all the other things that I had to learn in order to edit this film. It was definitely a big learning experience. Luckily, Dan was handling the color grade for this project, which is good because color grading on DaVinci Resolve is a little bit more complicated with the node structure and everything else. I only have a fairly basic understanding of color grading on DaVinci Resolve, and he did a much better job than I could have done. We also used Dehancer for the grain and halation, and we'll probably do a full color grading breakdown video at some point as well. Let me know if you'd like to see that. Now, cutting this film didn't have to take as long as it did, but because we had no real script and we had a whole bunch of footage that was just kind of improvised on the spot, constructing that into any kind of a coherent narrative just took a long time, and to be honest, I'm quite happy with how it came out considering how little we planned. Like, I'm quite impressed that it actually sort of makes sense and it's not completely too far from what we intended, even though, you know, a lot of people said there was no story, but that's kind of another topic. But it was one of those things where, like, we didn't really know what to expect. We didn't really realize just how important it would have been to at least plan like the essential shots very, very meticulously, and then have a plan where you're shooting and just execute those. And then after you done those, you can add a lot of improvised shots on the fly. But we basically just had like a couple of shots that we wanted to do and then improvised all the rest of it. But then it ended up adding so much more time in post that that's not the way to do it, but live and learn. Audio was very important for this film. We didn't even have dialogue, kind of because we just wanted one less thing to worry about, and also because our actors were basically just our friends or people who were, let's say, not professional actors. And dialogue is, in my opinion, where that kind of becomes most apparent. So even though, like, I didn't know who the actors were gonna be before we wrote this, but still, I figured if we can avoid most of the dialogue, it'll be just one less thing to worry about. We don't have to worry about audio, and even the few lines that we did have were cut in the end. But even though that was like the thinking behind it, I also think that it actually did work really well stylistically for this film, for the communication to be mostly through phones and visual storytelling as opposed to just dialogue. Also, I don't know how to write dialogue, so that's that's another reason. But then there was music and all the sound effects that you see. We only had like occasional lav mics for real audio and an audio recorder that we just forgot to use for the most of the time. So almost all of that was done in post. I can't tell you how many hours I spent looking for suitable music on 2 royalty-free sites that are not sponsored, but they are ones that I've just been using for a long time. They are Soundstripe and Artlist. I do have affiliate links, so you'll find those in the bio. But man, finding music that fits is an absolute nightmare, especially when you have like 6 or 7 different songs. Not to mention all the other audio effects. A lot of those we either found on the aforementioned sites, or some of them, like, I spent a lot of time just jumping on my bed trying to get the exact correct sound. And then Dan would yell at me and tell me that it's not right, and I had to do it again and again and again. And at least one thing that we did do right is the audio did end up being quite good. Like, there's not a single negative comment directed at the audio, even though everything else seems to have gotten mixed reviews. But the audio was good, and that's also one of those things that a lot of beginners will ignore. And if I made a film 2 years ago, I would have certainly screwed that up. And editing is a lot of compromises. You do notice, like, whenever you forgot to shoot a certain scene enough times and the footage just doesn't exist, so now you're forced to make a certain cut decision that just feels a little janky, but you just don't have any way to correct it, so you just put it in there and hope people don't notice too much. But this is also where it really helps to have at least minimum one person, and preferably just more people, to watch your drafts and comment on the parts they think don't work. Especially because when you're editing something for a long time, you can just completely lose sense of what's good and what's not. So having Dan tell me everything that was not working throughout the whole process, it was invaluable. I couldn't have done this without his feedback, and trust me, he does not hold back. And I think another funny thing about that is, like, I guess the real reason we released this film at the time we did is not because it was ready, but because both of us were just so sick of just looking at it at that point that it had to come out so we could move on to the next thing. Almost to the point where we were expecting everyone to hate it because we'd seen it 200 times and we'd been super focused on all the mistakes and little things that don't really matter as much as you might think. By the end of the time we were done editing it, we thought we made a horrible film, that we put it on YouTube, and the reaction honestly very much surprised at least me personally. Like, I guess the point is, like, when you're too close to something, it is difficult to see it objectively. Once we had the time to reflect on some of the mistakes that we made on this film, I think one of the most glaring things is that it was a combination of picking a story that was maybe a little bit too ambitious for essentially beginner filmmakers, combined with the fact that we just didn't prepare enough in terms of the script or the storyboards, that caused a lot of confusion in certain people who saw the film. We maybe could have done a much better job at communicating the points of the film a little bit more clearly while still avoiding being like too obvious. If we had done a better job scripting the most important parts of the film, that would have saved us so much time and made the film so much more clear. We didn't totally understand how important that was, especially for a concept that was a little bit vague. Now, it is a concept, Tokyo Solitude, this story that is about the little things in life. It's not a story that everybody will like, no matter what. But I'm just saying that if we did a better job at the planning stages of this film, we could have communicated the story a lot better, and a lot less people would have been confused about what the film was actually about. And even like some of the ideas that we had for the film just kind of didn't make their way into the final cut because we just kind of forgot to film them properly or communicate them clearly enough. We could have also done a much better job at communicating with the actors about what exactly we wanted the film to be about. Like, we should have probably met them before filming instead of just explaining it on set and then jumping right into it. Like, you can see how this could have gone much worse than it actually did. To be honest. Another thing that was a big learning experience for me personally was the fact that I was not behind the camera for basically the first time in my life, because I was the director, the producer, and the writer. I was not the DP. I was not the camera operator. And I'm used to being behind the camera. So when I wasn't behind the camera, I didn't fully understand the full scope of the job of the director. I understood the obvious parts where you tell the actor to be more sad and stuff. But what I didn't really totally understand is that the director is supposed to show up on set and have a very like clear plan and is supposed to be an actual leader of the project. It took me like 6 days of filming in total to finally kind of understand that was the job, like the full scope of the job. And what do you know, the last day of filming was actually so much smoother and easier and faster than any of the other days, simply because I actually did the job of directing at all instead of not doing it like on the earlier times. I think a lot of the directing job actually fell on the shoulders of Dan on the earlier shoots as well. But you know, live and learn. Now I know what the director is supposed to do for the next projects. And I do think we made the correct decision in dividing up the roles, because Dan did a great job in composing the film and color grading the film. And the few times we used lights, he was really good at using them. And he did a better job than I could have done. So it again brings that collaborative nature of filmmaking into the forefront a lot more. And you can't let your egos get in the way. You gotta just think of how do we make the best possible film if you really actually want to make a really good film. We also did some things right, believe it or not, during this process. What did we do right? Like, for example, the fact that we had no crew, it was just me and Dan, and the actors made it possible for us to get some shots that probably would have been a lot more difficult had it been like a proper professional film. Like, for example, the more people you add to the crew, the more difficult it becomes to show up at a moment's notice and shoot the rainy scenes. The more people you add, the more difficult it becomes to be discreet, and then you start needing permits. I do think we did a fairly good job of avoiding the worst possible cliches first-timer filmmakers usually make. And we did do a pretty good job of establishing a really cool mood of the film, and the visuals and the audio, I think, worked really well. And even the people who hated the film and thought it was boring do seem to think that it at least looked good. And I think most importantly, we got off our asses and actually made a film. And during this process, like I've talked about, we learned so many things that probably could not have been learned otherwise. No matter if you even went to a film school, you can't learn some of these things without actually trying to make a film. So I'm very happy to have this experience under my belt, and it was one of the most fulfilling experiences I've had with a camera, if not the most fulfilling experience, the most fun experience I've had. It feels like something that I should be doing. So if you're somebody who's maybe in a similar boat as me 1 year ago, maybe you can learn from some of my mistakes that I've talked about in this video. But most importantly, don't be afraid of filmmaking. Just get into it, and you'll learn on the way. And the film's never gonna be perfect on the first try. As soon as you give up the hope or the dream of making a perfect film on the first try, the sooner you actually ironically get closer to making a really good film. You just gotta go through the process. Short films are practice. They're a lot of fun, so just make one.